Welcome back to Czech the Tenders. Today we're diving into a topic that can be a bit tricky, especially if you're new to the world of Czech public procurement. International sanctions.
Yeah, it's something every company needs to be aware of.
Definitely, especially with everything going on in Ukraine.
Exactly. The EU's imposed some pretty serious sanctions against Russia, and those sanctions have a direct impact on how public procurement works in all EU countries.
Including, of course, the Czech Republic.
Right.
So no matter where you're coming from, if you're thinking about bidding on public contracts in the Czech Republic, this is something you've got to understand.
Absolutely.
Okay, so let's break it down. What's the main thing international businesses need to know about these sanctions?
Well, the EU has essentially said no more business with certain Russian entities.
Okay, that makes sense. But how does that actually work in practice?
So there's a key EU regulation that lays out all the rules. Council Regulation EU 2022-576, Article 5K in that regulation, that's the one you really need to pay attention to.
So this is like the rule book for dealing with sanctions in public procurement.
Yeah, exactly. Article 5K basically says you can't award or even carry out contracts with certain entities.
Which entities are we talking about?
We're talking about Russian nationals, companies that are based in Russia, and even companies with over 50% Russian ownership.
Oh, wow. So it's not just about avoiding direct deals with Russian companies. It's about looking at the entire structure of a company.
Right, exactly. And it goes even further than that.
Oh, how so?
It also covers subcontractors and suppliers.
Really?
Yeah. If their involvement in the project is over 10%, you need to check them out too.
So even if a company thinks they're in the clear, they could still run into trouble if one of their suppliers, say way down the line, has connections to a sanctioned entity.
Exactly. And that's why it's so important to do your due diligence. You need to know who you're working with at every level.
This sounds like it could be a nightmare for businesses, especially those with really complex global supply chains. How can they possibly keep track of all that?
It's definitely a challenge. But there are some tools and strategies that can help, which we'll get into later. For now, the big takeaway is due diligence is essential.
Okay, so we've talked about who you can't do business with. But are there any exceptions to the rules?
Yeah.
Like, are there ever times when working with a sanctioned entity might be okay?
There are a few specific exemptions in the regulation. Like, let's say you need essential services for a nuclear power plant here in the Czech Republic.
Okay.
And the only supplier of a critical component, well, if they happen to be a sanctioned entity, there might be a way to get around that.
So it sounds like most of these exemptions are about making sure things keep running, even with the sanctions in place, critical infrastructure, that kind of thing.
That's right. But even in those cases, it's not a simple process. You'd need authorization from the Czech government.
Makes sense.
And then they have to inform other EU member states and the European Commission.
So there's a whole process. All right, now I'm curious about this sanctions list I keep hearing about. Is that where you find out exactly who's sanctioned?
Yeah, you got it. It's maintained under Council Implementing Regulation, EU 2023-581, and it's constantly being updated.
So this is like the do not do business with list for anyone involved in public procurement.
You could say that.
And if a company is on this list, what does that mean?
It means you can't give them any money, you can't invest in them, and you can't give them any goods or services that would help them financially.
So this sanctions list, it sounds pretty important. How can companies be sure they're using it the right way?
Well, the most important thing is to check it regularly and make sure no one in your supply chain, even indirectly, is connected to an entity on the list.
All right, so we've got the sanctions list and all these regulations to navigate. This seems incredibly complex.
Yeah.
What does all of this actually mean for businesses on the ground? You know, the companies who are actually trying to bid on Czech public contracts.
It really comes down to due diligence. Companies have to really scrutinize their own structure and their entire supply chain.
So it's not just about checking your direct suppliers. You need to go deeper, look at their suppliers and so on.
Exactly. So, for example, let's say you're a construction company and you're bidding on some big infrastructure project in the Czech Republic. You might be sourcing materials from a supplier, and that supplier, maybe they're using a Russian company for a key component.
So even though the construction company itself isn't working directly with a sanctioned company, they could still get in trouble because of what their supplier's doing.
Right. And if they didn't do their due diligence, they could be disqualified from the tender. They could even face legal action.
Wow. That's a good example of why it's so important to be thorough.
Mm.
Are there any other situations like that that businesses need to watch out for?
Oh, tons. Say you're a software company bidding on a government IT contract. And one of your minority shareholders, it turns out, is on the sanctions list. A Russian national, let's say.
So even if the connection seems really unrelated to the actual work you're doing, it could still be a problem.
Yeah, and that's why transparency is so important. Companies need to be open about any connections they have, even if they seem minor.
So it's better to be safe than sorry.
Yeah, exactly. And it's not just about being transparent at the beginning. You have to stay informed because the sanctions are always evolving.
Okay, let's talk about staying informed. What are some concrete steps that companies can take?
Well, for starters, you should subscribe to updates from the EU and the Czech government. They're always publishing new regulations and making changes, so you need to be in the loop.
So sign up for the email list. Got it. What else?
It's also really important to connect with industry associations and talk to legal experts.
Okay.
They often have really valuable insights and updates. Sometimes they even know about things before they're officially announced.
So it's not just about reading the official documents. It's about talking to people and getting their take on things.
Exactly. And don't forget about technology. There are actually specialized databases and monitoring tools that can help you track sanctions lists and alert you if there are any potential problems in your supply chain.
Wow, there's software for that.
There is. That just shows how serious this all is.
So it's not something you can just ignore. Okay, so we've talked about due diligence, we've talked about transparency, we've talked about staying informed. What if a company does all that and still finds themselves in a tricky situation? Let's say they discover a connection to a sanctioned entity somewhere way down in their supply chain. What should they do?
Well, first, don't panic, but don't ignore either. You need to figure out what kind of connection it is and what the risks might be.
So get a clear picture of what you're dealing with.
Exactly. Then talk to a lawyer, preferably one who specializes in sanctions. They can help you figure out the best way to handle it.
So that might mean changing suppliers or disclosing the information to the contracting authority?
It might. A good lawyer can walk you through all of that, help you understand your obligations, and explore different options.
So it's like having a guide in this whole complicated legal world.
Exactly. Okay, we've covered a lot in this part. Real-world examples, why staying informed is so important, and what to do if you run into trouble. Is there anything else businesses should keep in mind?
I think the main thing to remember is that complying with sanctions is more than just checking a box. It's about your company's values. It shows you're committed to doing business ethically.
It's about doing the right thing.
Exactly. And in today's world, that's more important than ever.
So we've talked about what sanctions are and why they matter. In the next part, let's get into the how. We're back for our final look at international sanctions. We've talked about the challenges, but now let's get practical. What are some actual resources that can help businesses navigate this whole thing?
Oh, there are a bunch of great resources out there. One place to start is the European Commission's website.
They've got a whole section dedicated to sanctions. It's pretty user-friendly, actually. Gives you a good overview of everything and links to all the important regulations.
So that's a good first stop, get the basics. What about for the Czech Republic specifically? Are there any resources there?
Yeah, definitely. The Czech Ministry of Finance has tons of information on public procurement in the Czech Republic.
Okay.
They publish guidance documents and FAQs that specifically address sanctions and how they affect tendering.
All right, so we've got the official sources, but what about for deeper insights? Getting expert opinions and that sort of thing.
Oh, for that, you'll want to check out legal databases and publications that focus on sanctions law.
Okay.
Those are super valuable for staying on top of any new developments, any court rulings, that kind of thing. Some of them even have risk assessment tools and checklists you can use.
Oh, wow. So that's super useful for companies that have in-house legal teams. But what about companies that don't have those resources?
There's help for them too, don't worry. There are consulting firms that specialize in this.
Oh, okay.
They can give you personalized advice, conduct due diligence checks, even help you build a whole sanctions compliance program.
So no need to feel overwhelmed, basically. There are people who can help.
Right. Think of it this way. You wouldn't try to build a bridge without an engineer, right?
Right.
Well, dealing with sanctions compliance, it's kind of the same. You need the right expertise.
Good analogy. So as we wrap up this whole deep dive, what's the one key message you want our listeners to take away?
I think it's just recognizing that international sanctions are a reality in today's world.
They are.
And they play a really important role in public procurement here in the Czech Republic. Don't underestimate how complex they can be.
Or the consequences if you don't comply.
Exactly. But the good news is If you prepare properly and stay proactive, you can navigate it all successfully.
And that means doing your due diligence, staying informed, and getting expert advice when you need it.
Right.
Yeah.
Take those steps, and you'll be well on your way to success in the Czech market.
Great advice. So there you have it, folks, our deep dive into international sanctions and Czech public tenders. Thorough preparation and proactive compliance are key. Stay informed, seek expert advice, and don't be afraid to check those tenders. Thanks for joining us.